Welcome to the Caritas Consciousness Project and this evening's event, which I'm very excited about. And I think it's very timely. I'm sure you'll agree. Let me introduce, I'm Gloria, and let me introduce our speaker this evening. Steve McIntosh, JD, is president of the Institute for Cultural Evolution think tank. He is author of the recent book, Developmental Politics, How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself, as well as 3 previous books on integral philosophy. McIntosh is also co-author of the new book, Conscious Leadership, Leading Humanity Through Business, with John Mackey and Carter Phipps. Before becoming a writer and social entrepreneur, he had a variety of other successful careers, including founding the consumer products company Now and Zen, and practicing law with one of America's largest firms. His innovative political thinking has been featured on NPR, USA Today, The Daily Beast, Real Clear Politics, The Hill, and in a wide variety of other media. McIntosh is an honors graduate of the University of Virginia Law School and the University of Southern California Business School. He grew up in Los Angeles, now lives in Boulder, Colorado, with his wife and 2 sons. And so please welcome Steve McIntosh. And Steve, please take the mic.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria, for introducing me. It's lovely to see all of you tonight. Thanks a lot for joining us here on Zoom. It is, like you said, a propitious time to talk about politics. It's certainly been something I've been thinking about for many years. And obviously the events of earlier this month, the sacking of the Capitol building, the denial of the transition of the election. I mean, that's sort of this huge focus of us, and we certainly need to be aware of that and condemn it. And I'm certainly grateful that we've turned the page on that chapter in our history, and am looking forward to at least a relative return to normal in politics, although, normal for the last 30 years almost now is still hyperpolarized, gridlocked, dysfunctional American politics. But perhaps Biden can turn down the temperature a little bit on the culture war. But regardless, the problems of American politics, I would argue, can't be solved with an election, right? So I voted for Biden. I think it's an improvement, but we're still dealing with a country who, America, the social fabric of America is sort of torn and tattered in a way that the functionality of our government, as it was envisioned by the founders through a system of checks and balances, there's designed to be disagreement and compromise by design, and those designs, in some ways, have been thwarted by the hyperpolarization that has increasingly affected American politics. I would argue that the election of Donald Trump was more of a symptom of hyperpolarization and the related problems of the rupture of the fabric of our society. Not that there's ever been a period of consensus. I mean, there have been, after World War II, there's this period called the liberal consensus, in which there was exemplary bipartisan cooperation. So it's definitely possible. But even then, we had a left and a right. There's even some interesting research that shows that people are born with a proclivity to be conservative or liberal, or maybe the way to frame it would be, some people are born with a proclivity to try to protect and preserve what's right, and other people are born with a proclivity to fix what's wrong. And ultimately, I'm not suggesting that people are genetically determined to be left or right, but these predilections in your biology certainly don't dictate where you end up politically. But in almost every human polity we can analyze anthropologically through history, we can see that there's something like a left and a right that forms within most human deliberative groups. So the polarity itself, I think, can be healthy and cooperative, except over the last 25 years at least, we've seen it pulled apart in a way that the hyperpolarization prevents most attempts to compromise. Like each side has a kind of a veto on the positive programs of the other. And so this years of dysfunction in our politics sort of led to the disruptive candidate of Trump. But the same forces that brought that period of our history to the fore are still there. And so ultimately overcoming, growing out of the hyperpolarized condition of American culture and society is a very important project, long-term project, which ultimately is in some ways challenging the viability of our democracy. So in other words, a sense of duty that I feel and many others feel that the democracy is in distress. And it's not just a matter of one side permanently vanquishing the other. This polarity can either be healthy or unhealthy, but what we know about it is that it's indestructible. It's permanently recurring, right? So the more we can make a functional, a harmonized polarity where there can be challenge and support between the inevitable sides, the more we'll be able to hope for a functional phase of American politics and democracy in the future. So tonight, I want to talk about 4 themes, and I want to, I'll stop after each one, after each theme to hear questions or comments or objections. If you want to throw things at me, that's great. I mean, in other words, it's a political discussion, and the disagreements, that'll be good for us if we can air some of those and talk about some of those. So please keep your questions in mind or your objections as I talk, and we'll process those after each one of these 4 segments. The segments are, the first one is what I'm calling a cultural approach to politics. The second one is the practice of cultural intelligence, which is a new sort of leadership skill, if you will, that's emerging now, and I'll elaborate on that. I want to talk about what we're calling a post-progressive political perspective. This is certainly not an anti-progressive perspective, but it's one that tries to be even more inclusive than current progressive discourse is at the moment. So I'll talk about that. And then I'll finally finish with a consideration of what I call the political significance of transcendence, with transcendence being a kind of an umbrella term that stands for greater than self-interest, right? It can be highly spiritual and even religious, or it can be secular, but humans, that is, we've known since antiquity, right? Even in the Bible, it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And so that's a way of talking about a vision or some greater good or some American dream or some larger form of higher purpose for the society as a whole, or at least for major segments of the society. That's what I mean when I talk about transcendence as an inclusive umbrella term. And so we can talk about that. I deal with that idea quite a bit in my book, which Gloria mentioned, Developmental Politics. So hyperpolarization is of course caused by many things. There's many causes. The mainstream media, mainstream pundits like Ezra Klein, their analysis of it inevitably goes to sort of material things that they can measure. They talk about the displacement of middle class and blue collar jobs from globalization. They talk about the siloing of social media. They talk about racism and the sort of the fear of losing hegemony among certain voters. They talk about money in politics, gerrymandering. There are many structural, economic, historical forces that are contributed to the hyperpolarized condition of America. And so I'm not trying to reduce this to one cause. It's what's known as a wicked problem, many different causes and no clear solution. But one factor that's not talked about, you don't really see it in discussions in the mainstream about polarization. And I think that it's really the main cause, that if we can focus on the cultural dimensions of polarization, then I think that gives us the key. But because the perspective of much of the mainstream can't really see into culture, it's sort of a black box. They don't quite understand it, and they certainly don't understand how we might garden for emergence within it, how we might foster gently, the evolution of culture. But as I'll explain here, as I get into the nuts and bolts of this thinking, the main reason, the main world historical reason that America has come to this place is that our culture has evolved. It's evolved unevenly, such that not everybody lives in the same time in history. And since so much of it has been caused by the growth of culture, the stretching out of culture, especially over the last 50 years, the further solution, as I'll argue, is to grow further. That is to continue evolution, to grow a wider container. When I talk about evolution, I'm talking about a specific kind, cultural evolution, the evolution of consciousness and culture, to be specific. It's not the same thing as biological evolution or cosmological evolution, but it is in some ways a continuation of those forms of evolution. And we can learn a lot by comparing evolution in this psychosocial domain, or the noosphere, as it's sometimes called, or domain of human history, with the evolution of organisms in the biosphere and the evolution of the periodic table in the cosmos. So what ties all these different forms of evolution together is that they're all part of a larger structure of emergence, whereby ever since the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, something more has been coming from something less. And that process of something more coming from something less, not in a linear way, but in a way in which there is a growth in value, there is authentic progress, even while there's regress and stagnation. I mean, it's not linear, and it's not simply an upward escalator to the good. But for the last 13 billion years, evolution has been building on itself, adding new forms of value to the universe. And so that's almost a separate talk to talk about the structure of emergence. And indeed, the last time I talked to the Caritas Center was in 2012, where I presented in person my book that had just come out, Evolution's Purpose, where I talk about some of these ideas. And that was filmed in a pretty high quality video, which you can see online. So I would invite people to check that out if you're interested in more about these ideas about evolution. But the idea is, regardless of whether you characterize it as evolution or not, we want to make the society better. And one of the most direct ways we can make it better is by evolving our culture. That's how it's really gotten better. Anytime we can see the world has gotten better, we can say that maybe it's been a new artifact, maybe it's been a new discovery, maybe it's been an exemplary leader, but ultimately the permanent achievements of human history have accumulated by people trying to make things better. Unlike biological evolution, which only occurs through random mutation and environmental selection, it sort of proceeds inexorably. Cultural evolution only really usually happens when people try to make things better. So cultural evolution is on purpose, right? We are the agents of it. And the problems, the gnarly problems we face are the catalysts. They're the sources of energy, the pushing off points, or the points of departure. So the negative of the dysfunctional condition of American politics can be viewed from a positive perspective as a powerful stimulator of further growth. So that's kind of a framing of what I'm talking about. I came to this throughout my life. I've been very fascinated by periods of renaissance, periods of cultural fluorescence that have occurred in hundreds of different cultures throughout history. Obviously, the paradigm is the European Renaissance and then the subsequent Enlightenment. But there have been many other world historical emergences in different cultures, and I've tried to learn about all of them. Again, it's not something that can be engineered. but it's not something we just have to hope for. It is something that we can work toward and cultivate in ourselves, right? I mean, it's a cliche that we can become part of the change we want to see, but there's a deep wisdom in that. And so it's through my fascination with renaissances that I was led to integral philosophy, which is really a philosophy that focuses on the evolution of consciousness and culture. And that's been the focus of my working life since about 2000. I've written a variety of books, but it was around 2012 when we realized, myself and several colleagues in this field, we realized that we sort of had a duty to bring this understanding of cultural evolution and the evolution of consciousness to bear upon real societal problems. And at the time, the problem we were most concerned about was climate change. That's sort of the problem I'm still most concerned about. And in 2011, we had seen these conservative think tanks get funded, these boutique think tanks, which made a significant impact on the consensus in the United States for climate change. I mean, after Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, there was huge support for it politically. And then there was all this doubt thrown on it by these think tanks, as well documented by a frontline program called Climate of Doubt. The consensus, the poll data for climate change in America went down by 20 points. It's one of the most significant drops in public opinion on a given issue and ever measured. So it was right after this, we thought, okay, well, if there's if climate change could be derailed by boutique think tanks, we can create a boutique think tank that could be, having a powerful effect in the opposite direction to try to build political will for climate change. So we started working on that. We formed this think tank, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, in 2012. It became a 501c3 organization. We brought on some directors and some funding in 2013. But after working on the problem of climate change for quite a while, we began to realize that the reason that issue was stuck in American politics was for really a reason that was upstream for that this hyperpolarization, which was bad then and is even worse now, was really preventing people from agreeing with climate change, because those on the right who would otherwise see it in their interest saw the threat of progressivism as a trump card on climate change. It was like climate change was seen as purely a progressive issue. And because progressivism represented a kind of a cultural threat in the minds of folks on the right, we figured that one of the most effective ways we could increase political will for climate change would be to focus on overcoming hyperpolarization. And that's been the primary focus of my work since then. We've done a lot of different activities. We've recently written this book, and so now we're going out with a kind of a political campaign. And so that's a separate issue. We can talk about that a little bit more at the end. But let me just jump into this first segment of the talk, and then we'll get to some questions. And that is this cultural approach to politics. So by culture, I mean, in a sense, the dictionary definition of it. It's our shared meanings, our language, our shared values, even though they're not entirely shared, but cultures cohere around values, shared sense of identity, shared life ways. I mean, culture is the sort of interior collective, collective conscious and unconscious by which, in which we swim, and that the cultural structures, cultural agreements, cultural understandings, in a sense, supervene on our consciousness. I mean, we participate in culture with our subjective minds, but culture also shapes our thoughts, sometimes even thinking our thoughts for us, depending on, how independent a person is. But so culture is this realm of agreement. And in this realm of agreement, and disagreement, of course, is part of it. We want to get our hands on culture. We want to be able to see through to it, see the interiority of it, where we might be able to understand it better and become more sympathetic to it, and thereby learn how to work with it more effectively, is this idea of layers. So maybe, Gloria, you can put up the first slide. Okay, so this is a fancy graphic. I'm calling it the strata of the political landscape. It shows this typical geology textbook cross-section of the land. And so I'm using this as an analogy. The surface of politics is the elected officials, right? And the media that reports on them, what we see, on TV and on the internet about what's going on with politics, right? Directly below that, the strata or layer are political parties, right? That develop policies and determine the candidates and influence the candidates. And that's a big area of activity, of course, within politics. Below that, below the level of the parties are the real issues and interests. And those can sometimes cause people to change parties or become dissatisfied with their party if they don't see the issues they care about being championed. And most politics stay at those top three levels. But underneath all of that is this layer of what I'm calling bedrock values. That's the sort of the foundational level. And although the notion of values may seem like the least malleable, right, or the most concrete layer in that strata, sometimes when there's pressure, just like this geological analogy, right, when there's pressure, rocks can become transformed, they become metamorphic. And so getting at this bedrock level of values is where this politics of culture begins. Okay, so you can take that slide down for the moment, or maybe just go to the next slide. Okay, so looking at values, right? There's thousands and thousands of values, thousands and thousands of outlooks on values, maybe millions. But what values do, a way of understanding values as opposed to some abstract term, is to see how they play out in history. And as I argue at length in Developmental Politics, they play out in history. That's good, the worldview slide, in worldviews, right? So a worldview is not just an ideology. It's not just a particular person's view or a particular group's view. The way I'm using it, the defined term, is as world historical structures of agreement, mutual commitments, that the glue of which is values. And we can see how these have emerged in history. So I've got in yellow there traditionalism. This is a rough demographic estimate of the current state or center of gravity of the three major worldviews in America at the moment. There are earlier pre-traditional worldviews, and inevitably there'll be worldviews that come after progressivism. But in the timeline of human history, this traditional worldview, usually a religious worldview, is the oldest, right? Goes back thousands of years. This thing I'm calling modernity or modernism or modernists, this is the worldview that emerged with the Enlightenment and which has transformed the world. It's in the developed world at least. Of course, it's brought very important positives like scientific medicine and democracy and personal freedoms, liberal values. It's also been responsible for horrific colonialism and environmental degradation and inequality, right? So each one of these cultural structures have both important, what I call dignities, and also disasters, right? Problems that viewed from the outside can be quite horrific. So I'll unpack what I mean by that in a moment. But this traditional worldview, it still represents the cultural center of gravity, about 30% of Americans in the United States. So, I'm not trying to, I want to avoid pigeonholing people or talking in simplistic categories. There's a lot of sophisticated empirical research behind this understanding, as well as a philosophical understanding. So I'm sort of just asserting it here, but I'm happy to unpack questions and talk about the thinking that led to this understanding of these three major worldviews as a way of understanding American culture, right? So traditionalism, their main, one way of looking at these worldviews is frames of the beautiful, the true, and the good, horizons of improvement, right? So within the traditional worldview, they may certainly appreciate science and use scientific medicine, but for many folks who are traditionalists, the Bible trumps whatever science says. If the Bible and science disagree, then they're inclined to believe the Bible, which again is something that is worth honoring. There's something deeply honorable and important about traditionalism. And so I want to keep emphasizing throughout that each one of these major cultures has important positives and debilitating negatives. So the traditional religious worldview, certainly, evangelicals constitute 30 million people by themselves. Certainly not every evangelical is entirely traditionalist in their worldview, but even mainstream commentators who don't look at culture from an evolutionary perspective certainly agree that we have the traditional worldview and this more modern secular worldview. And a lot of the analysis stops there. In other words, really for the last 30 years, there's been a lot of talk, both in academia and in popular discourse, around the difference between modernity and traditionalism, right? Some may remember Thomas Friedman's book from the 1990s, the Lexus and the Olive Tree, where he uses the olive tree as the symbol of traditionalism and the Lexus as the symbol of modernity, and talks about the contradictions and how, that they're both in a cultural truce with each other within America, at least throughout history in fits and starts, but they're also modernity rejects and pushes off. I mean, modernity originally emerged, this worldview of modernism originally emerged in the Enlightenment by rejecting the societal political control of traditionalism, right? By rejecting feudalism, by rejecting kings, by bringing the rights of the individual, the rights of man, as the French called them during the Revolution. And the thing that modernity brings, besides science and technology and liberal values and democracy, et cetera, is what's been called the Great Enrichment. We sort of take it for granted, but even if, I'm certainly not rich, but the average person in the United States and in pretty much every developed country makes 5,000 times as much money. They live on 5,000 times as much money as people throughout history. So that throughout history, from an economic perspective, humans, the vast majority of humans, lived on the modern equivalent of $2 to $3 a day. And with the emergence of modernity, there was this way in which the society itself, now that creates problems, inequality, but for the fact that we have all been enriched in a way by the emergence of this form of culture, despite the pathologies that have come along with its emergence, it's something that it's important for us not to take for granted. So without spending too much time talking about the dignities of modernity, the reason this way of seeing is very important is because it allows us to see the historically significant cultural emergence that's occurred in the last 50 years. And that is this third major worldview, this third phase of human history and this timeline of evolutionary emergence, which is this what formerly called the progressive postmodern worldview. And this is a worldview that you can see in its infancy, beginning with Rousseau and the Transcendentals. But really in the 1960s, it sort of bursts forth. It makes a separation. There's a sort of pushing off and the emergence of something new, which begins as a counterculture, but over the last 50 years, which has matured into a kind of a counter-establishment, and it brings many important dignities, a new layer of moral concern for social justice, for environmental justice. In some ways, I would say progressivism is the most evolved form of large-scale culture that's yet to appear along the timeline of human history. But as with these other worldviews, progressivism also brings pathologies. Now, in its emergent phase, these pathologies are rather trivial compared to the pathologies of modernity and traditionalism. But history's been accelerated, and now as progressivism comes of age, as a worldview with its own cultural and growing political power, the inevitable shortcomings that go with every cultural value structure begin to appear. But again, these are inevitable. They're some things we can deal with, and I'll talk about the potential pathologies of progressivism in a second. But let me just talk a little bit more about how these structures are formed. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, these are those same three worldviews, but they're now, instead of a timeline from left to right, in the timeline, this takes those same cultural structures and arranges them along the familiar left-right political continuum. Now, most commentators agree that this idea of left and right is sort of something it's woefully inadequate to describe the political realities of the moment, but at least it's a starting point for orienting what I'm saying to our current political condition. So here we have progressivism on the far left and traditionalism on the far right. There are certainly progressives who are more conservative and traditionalists who are what you might say more liberal. But in terms of demographics, the vast majority of people who identify with a progressive set of values vote on the left, right? They support Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Again, I'm not trying to pigeonhole this too narrowly, but I'm just trying to give you contemporary touchstones so you know what I'm talking about. Progressivism is alive and well in American politics and showing many positive signs that I support and agree with. Traditionalists, again, there are many members, highly religious traditionalists, even some biblical fundamentalists who vote Democrat because they always have. But in terms of demographic numbers, the vast majority of people who make meaning using this traditional worldview are reliably to be counted on the right of American politics. So modernity, which I show in the previous slide as one big red circle, representing about 50% in terms of its cultural center of gravity, is still the major mainstream worldview for the majority of Americans. In this chart, it's divided into two, that's because of these forces of polarity, right? So we're talking about political polarity. Everybody knows that there's the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and that they're highly polarized between them. And usually the analysis in the mainstream media stops there. Red states and blue states, it's simply a duopoly. But when we begin to understand what these polarities are and how they've arisen in the evolution of culture, we can begin to understand them with more nuance. So the arrow at the top shows the overall overarching polarity between left and right, with which we're all familiar. But the sub-arrows show the polarity on the left between liberal modernists, what the media calls moderates, and progressives, right? So there's even though many of them share the same policies and they're willing to work together, there's clearly a difference between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, with Biden representing the liberal modernists and Sanders representing the progressives. We could see the same thing on the right. It's not quite as strong because it's not as much in play, but there's a polarity on the right between modernists who are not necessarily religious traditionalists, but they're fiscally conservative, or they're libertarian, or they're concerned about the excesses of the left. So that's sort of still modernity, but modernity has a left and a right, whereas traditionalism is mostly right and progressivism is mostly left. And the reason that modernity is divided is that in the timeline of emergence, as these worldviews emerge, there's a natural tendency, as they push off against each other, to oscillate from a communitarian focus to a more individualistic focus, right? So the traditional worldview has a very communitarian focus organized around religious belonging. Modernity breaks from that by championing the rights of the individual against the oppressive church and feudalism. But then modernity's shortcomings, its hyper-individualism in some cases, lead to the yearning for a new kind of collectivity, a new communitarian worldview, which progressivism represents in important ways. And so because modernity is sort of a focus on individual liberal values about carving out freedom for the individual, from the beginning, it's always used the moral system up until recently. The religious traditional moral system has provided a very important sense of social solidarity for modernity. Modernity, in a sense, borrowed the social capital of traditionalism, carrying it forward. And until the 1960s, religious traditionalism pretty much supplied the moral system that most modernists adhered to. Even though they didn't want traditional religion to run the government, if somebody ran afoul of traditional values, it was a scandal, right? There was a sort of expectation that people were going to be pious in one way or another, at least political leaders and other leaders in the society. So there was this cultural coupling between the moral system of traditionalism and the individualistic focus of modernity. And that strong moral system was part of the larger cultural ecosystem, if you will, that these worldviews represent. Then in the 60s and throughout the last few decades, we've seen progressivism emerge. It's an alternative moral system to traditionalism. It has a different notion of the beautiful, the true, and the good, and a different sense of what it means to live a moral and good life. And so in the course of this emergence of progressivism, we now see this cultural tug of war between these two seemingly incompatible moral systems: traditionalism pulling on the right, progressivism pulling on the left, and modernity increasingly being pulled into now many liberal modernists. The progressivism, they may not agree with every progressive program, but they have a sense of allegiance to progressive values in a way that they liberal modernists once had an allegiance to traditional values. So we're talking in broad cultural terms, but it's important to get a 30,000-foot view to be able to step outside whichever one of these cultural segments you may resonate with or identify with. Part of the power of cultural intelligence, which I'm about to explain, is allows us to step outside, look at these cultures from not only within in terms of our own predilections, but from without in terms of the greater good of the society as a whole. Right? If we're going to take the spiritual teaching that we're all one seriously, then ultimately this applies to the most challenging place where we have to deal with that truth, and that is in politics, where there's certainly not an all one feeling. At least there hasn't been for quite a while. So we're talking about a cultural view of politics. It looks into the level of values. It sees that values evolve over time through using structures of agreement, which are these cultural structures. They can be viewed along a timeline, or they can be viewed along the left-right spectrum. There are other historical worldviews along the timeline that precede traditionalism, like I said, and others that will eventually come after. Progressivism is not the end of history, just like modernity is not the end of history. But this is a sort of very quick introduction to what I mean by a politics of culture. And so let me just stop talking there for a second to see if there's any comments or questions before I go on. You can take the slide down now.
Any questions? I don't see any chats.
It's a lot to digest. So I'm not, don't feel like, oh, there's no questions. It's a problem. I mean, in Zoom groups like this, it's better to just think about it. I just want to make sure that there's not, people who are wondering what the hell I'm saying, or people who are triggered by what I'm saying. So I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Joe and Cam said that was very comprehensive. Thanks.
Okay.
So we have a comment, not a question, but a comment.
Well, good. I'll take it.
Yeah, same here. I agree. I think you're smack on.
Okay, good. Thank you. Great. Well, that's encouraging. So let me go on then, unless there's any other questions. Okay. So next.
Sorry, Donna has a question.
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Don. Great stuff, Steve. A couple questions about where some of the categories come from, and particularly you had sort of 20% progressive, 50% modernist, right? You put some numbers there.
Right.
Is that, how do you come?
Well, these are rough estimates. There's some sociology behind it. Probably the most empirical form of sociology that points to this. Sociology is the findings of sociology are limited, and how much weight we can put on them, right? But since the late 1970s, I think, there's been a sociological global survey by the University of Michigan called the Worldview Survey. And you see it cited quite a bit in the commentariat. And it's an international questionnaire that's administered every few years to demographic groups throughout the world. And in there, they've charted what they call post-material values, right? So they notice the move in the developed world, especially from these traditional values to these more secular values, these achievement values. And then as those achievement values gain traction, then that leads to the emergence of post-material values, where it's a different kind of achievement. So I can't say that this is straight out of the World Values Survey. There's certainly a degree of historical, philosophical interpretation, but some of these numbers are also backed up from some legitimate academic sociology that was funded in the 1990s by the sociologist Paul Ray, who identified these categories. He was one of the first people to identify progressivism, as I'm calling it, as a significant new emergence in American culture and a demographic, a politically significant demographic in its own right. He called the group the cultural creatives. And, he gave approximate, right. The reason that it's hard to find hard data on how is that these worldviews are really, they're structures of agreement in the space between us, in our shared understandings. And they penetrate, supervene on people's minds more or less. So some people identify completely with these worldviews. Other people are kind of disengaged from these value structures. And actually, most Americans use different structures of culture at different times. So, for example, you might be a traditionalist on Sunday morning when you're at church, and then you go to work on Monday morning and you're a modernist. So these are ways of looking at what's true, beautiful, and good that aren't, necessarily exclusive. Like most of these worldviews sound in people's consciousness more in chords than in single notes, right? There's certainly plenty of people who are singular. And as
Sure.
polarization has pushed things apart, that has driven a sort of circling of the wagons and a sense of loyalty to your worldview in the face of the attack of the other. But these structures are, these are rough estimates. That's why I use round numbers like 30, 50, and 20. But it's much more messy than that. But this is a basic introduction, so I hope you'll allow me to oversimplify.
So I'm expecting you're going to get to this, the next part of it, but relating that to the four circles on the previous
Yes.
diagram is, I'm trying to map all of that onto, in 2016, Donald Trump got 51% of the vote. And in, this year he got 49% of the vote.
Yes.
So who are,
Who's voting for Trump?
Is 51 on the two, is it the two circles are on one side, the two circles on the other side? Is that all it is?
Yeah. So for graphical simplicity, I show those four circles being of equal size, just to get the point across, right? But if we were looking at modernity, we'd probably say that it's probably 60-40, 60% liberal, left modernity, and 40% right modernity, so that the 30% that are traditionalists, marry or join with the 20, the other 20% of the right wing of modernity to make up the 50%.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. And in the book, I actually have a footnote that says these are equal circles because it's just too complicated if we try to get the demographics perfect. Any kind of graphic, if you put too much weight on it, and if you try to accommodate all the nuances, it becomes graphically not very useful, right? So, but I'm glad you pointed that out because this gives me a chance to say these aren't perfectly even that way, and the worldviews aren't simply 30, 50, and 20, but just to give you an idea of the rough structures of these value locations within American culture. Every day when we look at the news, we see validation of this, and so again, we could get into some of the more interesting details of that. But let me keep skimming along at a high level, and if you don't feel satisfied with the question of how we got to that estimate, we can unpack it some more at the end.
So I have one question, and that is, as you're tracking the emergence of these different worldviews, do you see them as developmental?
Definitely. The book Developmental Politics is all about, if we want to understand, if we want to deal with hyperpolarization, we have to understand culture more thoroughly. And if we want to understand culture, as I argue, we need to see that it develops, that it's a developmental process. I mean, culture and consciousness with technology, it's not simply culture that's evolving. It's culture and the minds and values of people and the artifacts and writings and technologies in the world that correspond to those different cultural levels. But a development is definitely in process, And what's important to say is that the development is not, like I said at the beginning, it's not a linear development. It's it proceeds. Part of the way of seeing this development is like a sailboat tacking against the wind, right? So a sailboat can't sail directly into the wind. It has to advance obliquely and then tack to kind of deal with the headwinds that it's trying to go against. And in culture primarily evolves because people are trying to improve the human condition. And that's got both a push and a pull. It's got the push of problematic life conditions that are, causing real urgency to make those stop. But it's also got degrees of inspiration and the vision of a higher way. And so there's different inspirations for the evolution of culture. But these cultural structures, they focus on their values are in a sense shaped by the problems that are at hand in the time of history when they first emerge. So traditional values are very civilizing and group creating because when traditionalism as a worldview first emerges thousands of years ago, the most troubling and problematic life condition is warlords, raiding and sacking and murder. And so while war continues within traditional cultures, there's some degree of law. There's some degree of political control and political protection. And so we can see how so many of those traditional values are focused on those pre-traditional warring cultural forms. And even though those life conditions are no longer present, the values persist, right? And sometimes they oversolve or try to find those conditions or, try to solve problems that don't really exist anymore. Maybe not entirely, but there's plenty of life conditions for which traditional values remain a very important remedy to a set of problems. So it's not as if traditional values are outdated, but not entirely. But each one of these worldviews is in a sense formed at its time of history. So modernity emerges in the Enlightenment, right? And it emerges, it's a sailboat that's, traditionalism had gone as far as it could go, at least arguably, in its ability to improve the human condition within its horizon of potential improvement, right? Your ability to make the human condition better depends on what you define as better. And so when you exhaust the better that your worldview points to, it's time to break out of that horizon of improvement and improve your definition of improvement itself, right? But that improved definition, that improved horizon of potential improvement is defined by what was wrong with the previous structure. So inevitably, it's not a sailboat that's sailing direct to the good. It's sailing partially toward what's better, but partially away from what's wrong. So it's always characterized in a sense by getting away from what's wrong, which means the next world you can only go so far before you need to tack back in the opposite direction. So modernity comes along, it solves the caste system and the oppression and the ignorance and many of the shortcomings of the medieval societies from which it emerges. And it does make things better in terms of bringing democracy and bringing scientific medicine and liberal values and the Great Enrichment, as I said, many of these things. But of course, along with those improvements come new problems that are, in a sense, much worse. I mean, traditionalism had, torture and oppression and all kinds of negative things, right? Racism. But modernity threatens to wipe out the biosphere, right? Traditionalism never did that, right? So there's ways in which modernity brings important new dignities, but it also brings new threats, which means that we have to keep going. That those very threats of emergent modernity cause the people who want to improve life conditions on Earth to have to break out of that worldview, right? Like modernity had made things better as much as it possibly could in some ways. I mean, it's still making things better. All these worldviews are. But by the late 50s, early 60s, the middle class children, the baby boomers who'd grown up in this wealthy post-war society they had already had almost everything modernity had to offer in terms of upward mobility, education, wealth. And they looked at the problems of modernity and said, this is where we need to focus now. If we want to make the world a better place, we can see that modernity is unsustainable, right? It's unsustainable environmentally, it's unsustainable culturally. And we're sick of this rat race. We're gonna break and the sailboat's gonna tack back in another direction. And so this pushing off against, you can see it, for example, when modernity emerges from traditionalism, it pushes off against, like during the French Revolution with a rallying cry, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's in some ways a distillation of modernist values and the break with traditionalism. right? Well, so there's a similar, although semi-humorous slogan that comes with the birth of progressivism, which is Timothy Leary's slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out. And that in some ways, at least at the time, was a distillation of progressive values. Drop out, right? Forget being a junior executive, forget joining the rat race. We envision a more beautiful world, a more egalitarian world, a less status-seeking, material chasing world, right? So this birth of progressivism was this tacking of the sailboat, but because progressivism, and this is a key point, because I have identified as a progressive all my life, and I still have deep sympathies with it. So I'm not anti-progressive. I want to see many of the laudable goals of progressivism achieved. So part of my political efforts are to forward those goals, but to overcome the hyperpolarization to make those goals actually come to life. Hence my focus on climate change led to hyperpolarization. So we want a more loving, beautiful world. We want a world that's more equal. We want, racial equality, gender equality, environmental sustainability. In my book, those are all urgently needed reforms and places we need to grow into. But the key pathology, I would argue, that progressivism brings, that's inevitable. It couldn't, we can't really blame it. It's just what was on store for it in history is the reason why it's not the end of history. And that is that progressivism, this progressive postmodern worldview that emerges, as a freestanding worldview in the 60s, a separate form of culture, which is certainly integrated. There are people who make meaning using both. Again, I need to not oversimplify it. I want to keep complexifying it. But it emerges by rejecting the society, the establishment truths which had come to gel by the early 60s between traditionalism and modernity, right? There was this sort of cultural truce whereby, traditionalism could supply the morality, but modernity was in charge of the politics. And this was functional for a while, but it was the establishment. It was what the early progressives saw as corrupt and morally illegitimate and hypocritical, right? So there was the political will, the cultural momentum that allowed progressivism to be born and emerge as a worldview in its own right. It had to sort of, in some ways, almost exaggerate the problems it was pushing off against, right? Just like with modernity emerging, right? The Voltaire's rallying cry during the French Revolution was, remember the cruelties. So they really had to remind people of the pathologies of progressivism to recruit them into this emergent worldview. Same thing happens with progressivism. They have to characterize this establishment as bankrupt. And indeed, many of their critiques are certainly valid to this day, right? There is many ways in which the traditionalism and modernity are bankrupt and guilty and deserve to be condemned. But that same spirit of rejectionism, let's call it, that same sort of black and white, so if we had excessive patriotism in America in the 1950s, right, where it was sort of America could do no wrong, and it was sort of, we had this kind of one-sided jingoistic sense of patriotism, their opportunity for evolution was to reject that and to focus on the crimes of America, right? And of course, there are certain proponents, voices within progressivism to get attention and to sort of serve the transcendent force that was animating the emergence of progressivism. It was in their interest to exaggerate those, right? To characterize America as simply a sinister criminal enterprise, right? That is, we're going to focus on, slavery and the genocide, and that's what America's all about. And certainly those are huge crimes that need to be atoned for. But just like excessive pride by itself is pathological, excessive shame, I would argue, it also limits its value creating capacity. Ideally, we can recognize these two things, pride and shame, as interdependent, right? That our pride needs to be, moderated and conditioned by a degree of shame. And likewise, our shame needs a bit of pride, right? We need grievance and gratitude. But because of the opportunities of history, because of the discontents of evolution, right, it's inevitable that in some ways these taxing back and forth go too far, right? That's why they're not the end of history. That's why inevitably we have to tack back. So with progressivism, we see a pattern, a very interesting evolutionary pattern that is, in a sense, characterizing the structure of emergence since the Big Bang. I would say that it's the pattern of the larger universe that is self-similarly or fractally expressed in almost every moment, every instance of emergence. And this is this pattern first identified by Hegel called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And again, there's, he didn't use those terms. He talked about an affirmation and then a negation and then a negation of the negation, right? Which is in some ways a more philosophically nuanced and correct interpretation of Hegel's expression. But this isn't simply the Hegelian dialectic. This understanding of the way things emerge in cosmological evolution, in biological evolution, in cultural evolution, and you can see it just fractally distributed across the universe. It's really amazing how frequent it can be detected. But you can also see it in the small and the large, and in the large, meaning the evolution of human worldviews in the timeline of history, we see this pattern whereby opportunities for evolution involve a pushing off against the thesis, right? So the thesis is the condition of society, the status quo. And inevitably, every status quo begins to decay. No matter how good a given status quo is, there's this evolutionary restlessness that's part of the human condition that knows that however good things are better, right? And this yearning to be better, in a sense, is one of the forces. Another force is the inevitable decay, a sort of cultural entropy that leads to a degree of complacency and staleness within any given cultural condition. And the way to break out of that is through this movement of antithesis, right? Another way of talking about it is transcendence and inclusion, right? The antithesis transcends, it breaks out. But it's unstable in a way. In other words, to get to a new thesis, a new stable condition that's at least sustainable for a while, there is a movement to what Hegel called, and what has since been widely discussed by non-Hegelians, as this synthesis, whereby there's a reestablishment of an agreement. So modernity and traditionalism was a kind of a thesis in their cultural truths. Progressivism pushes off against and represents a clear antithesis to modernity, a rejection, a righteous rejection of modernity and traditionalism for very good reasons. But because it's an antithesis, that same spirit of rejectionism, right? That same hermeneutics of suspicion, as it's sometimes been called, that same sort of dim view or sort of jaundiced, cynical, ironic characterization, whereby patriotism is seen as just something foolish, if not loathsome, right? So this spirit of antithesis has taken the societies, at least within progressivism, they've achieved many important things. They've achieved a new layer of moral concern, which we're going to need if we're going to become a more moral civilization. So again, this is a welcome and very powerful form of cultural emergence. But the reason it's not just the end of history, one of the reasons is that it has pathologies. And so the pathologies are in some ways based around its antithesis, its constitutional antithesis, its rejectionistic ethos. And that leads to anti-modernism, the sort of the view of modernity as simply bad, right? The taking of these liberal values that go with modernity as simply granted, like they're in the Constitution, we don't have to worry about those. Or wealth, we're already wealthy, we have iPhones, we have nice cars. And so there's this way in which modernity is, the good part is taken for granted, and the bad part becomes the major focus, right? And there are indeed bad parts, and again, that focus is not all wrong. But because of this rejectionistic spirit, one of the key problems of progressivism, it is at a very hard time convincing the rest of our democratic society to vote for Bernie Sanders or to go all in on climate change. And part of it is that the rest of the society can feel that sense of rejection. Progressives can't see the cultural threat that they represent to traditionalists. It just seems like progressivism is just positive and the way forward, and indeed it is. But if you're a traditionalist, you feel the animosity, you feel that your cultural structure is in a sense being dissolved. Your values are being dissolved. And so you're willing to dig in your heels and put somebody like Trump in the White House, not because you like him, but because you need a cultural bodyguard. You need somebody to protect you from the corrosive effects that progressivism, given political power, at least from their perspective, might have on Western civilization and everything that's been achieved. So again, I'm not saying that this is my view, but I think it's very important if we're going to step outside, if we're going to get cultural intelligence, as I've been talking about, then we need to be able to see the structure from above. We need to be able to see progressive, even if we're deeply progressive. I would say our ability to be effective politically in our own opinions and in our activism it really depends on our ability to see our worldview from the outside. And that's what cultural intelligence, that's the way it begins. It's a perspective. One of the most famous and well-respected developmentalists is this professor of education at Harvard, a developmental psychologist. His name's Robert Keagan, and he's cited a lot in this body of thought we call integral. And Keagan has a very interesting perspective on how to understand the evolution of consciousness. So the way he says is that your consciousness evolves when you can make an object out of something that was once your subject. So if it's your subject, then that subject has you, right? You have to, in some ways, you have a great incentive to try to view the world and make the world fit to be consistent with your subjective worldview. But if you can evolve your consciousness by stepping outside that worldview, you can still have it. Like, so for example, if you're a deeply religious person, if you can evolve your consciousness by, instead of making everything have to fit the Bible, you can still be deeply devoted to your religion, but you can see it from the outside as well as the inside. It's not just your subjective worldview. It's also something you can step outside of. You can have it rather than it having you, right? So that's a simple way of understanding the evolution of consciousness. I mean, there's much more to it, of course, but this idea of just stepping outside these worldviews and begin to see these cultural structures, seeing them as objective features of our cultural landscape, even though our subject may be embedded in one of them, we can evolve our consciousness in the immediate and simple step of looking at it from the outside as well as the inside, right? And seeing that it's not the end of history, so it's not simply all right with anything that doesn't agree with it being all wrong. So your question, in a sense, has got me launched into this next unit, which I've already gone significantly through, which is this practice of cultural intelligence. But let's look at the next couple of slides to
I have one mini question that you can answer yes or no, and that is: do you see the development as accelerating?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. Okay, so Gloria, can you put up the next slides? Okay, so this idea of cultural intelligence, leave it there for just a second before you go to the next. Just leave it there. Yeah, that's good. This idea of cultural intelligence, it's a synonym for what we call integral consciousness, which is like progressivism as a form of consciousness, modernity is a form of consciousness. This integral overview perspective is a form of consciousness, but cultural intelligence is a way of using the insights of integral consciousness without necessarily identifying with whatever worldview it may represent. And cultural intelligence is the ability to see each one of these cultural structures sympathetically. It's the process of teasing apart the dignities and the disasters from each one of these worldviews, being able to see not just, most progressives seem modernists, at least some of the more simple-minded ones, see modernists as simply greedy. Like modernism is materialistic and superficial, right? And traditionalism, those people are living in a fairy tale, right? That's just something that's just beyond the pale. But I would argue, and I argue it at length in developmental politics, that actually these structures are part of a larger cultural ecosystem. That just like evolution at every level works like Russian dolls, whereby the accomplishments of previous levels, less complex levels, are taken up and used, encompassed, enveloped by the next emerging level. But that the core competencies and achievements of these earlier levels are necessary for the larger structure to be sustainable. And when those earlier accomplishments are inadequately included, then the structure eventually collapses back to an earlier level. So, I mean, the simple analogy is atoms they're transcended and included by molecules as we move from physics to chemistry. And then from, molecules are eventually transcended and included by cells as we move from chemistry to biology. And then, that organisms are eventually, in a sense, transcended and included by larger cultural structures. And again, that's an oversimplification, but just to make the point, as I mentioned earlier, that modernity emerges by borrowing the social capital of traditionalism. It depends on the accomplishments of traditionalism. Likewise, progressivism, even though many progressives would deny it, progressivism actually depends upon the conditions of a wealthy and liberally free society, right? Progressivism can only emerge in a very inchoate form if it's not emerging from a developed world situation. In other words, the freedom and prosperity that allows people to search for higher values, to look for new ways to make the world a better place, only occurs when they're not in survival mode, when they're not trying to feed their kids. It's very hard to be overly concerned about the environment for most people when they're overly concerned about their next meal. Now, again, there are traditionalists who are very environmental. I mean, again, I'm oversimplifying, but allow me to say these things because I'm trying to give you a sense of the bigger picture. And in the bigger picture, these worldviews form an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is formed by the positives of each. The rub is that each one has negatives, and the others primarily view each other for their negatives, which is understandable, but cultural intelligence is the ability to transcend that stuck condition. So that involves understanding that these overarching arrows aren't just convenient ways of talking about conflict or difference. They're actually part of the behaviors or the physics or the natural conditions that occur through development. Just like systems are a natural part of development, and stages or steps or levels are a natural part of systems, the way they behave. In between these levels are these interdependent relationships, which I talked about earlier in terms of pride and shame, right? Or we could also say real and ideal, or liberty and equality. Almost any value, any positive value you can mention is in an interdependent system with a value that's not so much an opposite, but it's a complement. So if we were only concerned about liberty, we'd end up with gross inequality. If we were only concerned about equality, we'd have to significantly truncate liberty. So ideally, we want liberty and equality to work together to challenge and support each other to maximize the value creating capacity of each of those principles, right? So these polarities are, they have their own physics, they have their own practice. That's its own lecture. It's a boutique industry now within organizational development called polarity management, where executives in all kinds of organizations, all kinds of different levels, are using this value technology of creating relationships of challenge and support. I mean, just like you have marketing and accounting, right? And in a business, both are important. One's building, the other's protecting, and that's an interdependent polarity, because you don't want to just protect, or you'll stagnate. If you just build and you don't have any accounting or protecting, then you're gonna become unsustainable. So this polarity is a part of the physics of value, and it's part of the deeper understanding of this practice of cultural intelligence. So let me unpack that. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so don't try to read what's on here. I'm just throw up these words to give you an idea of of how we might apply this idea of creating a container of challenge and support within a polarity. So this is the polarity on the left, the polarity between liberal modernists in blue and progressive postmodernists in green. I've given each one of these categories a kind of a nickname, right? So in other words, the liberal modernist values are very concerned about fairness, right? The fairness of the individual against big business, the fairness of the sexes, the fairness of the races. I mean, liberal modernity has been concerned with fairness for a long time, and progressive postmodernity, doubles down. I mean, they go from fairness to caring, right? It's not just a matter of making things fair; it's a matter of rehabilitating and focusing on those who've been marginalized or exploited or oppressed. So the polarity here, to make this a simple point, is that the liberal modernists, they have a whole set of positive values, and they have a whole set of negatives that go with that, as indicated by the top level and the bottom level of this chart. Likewise, progressivism has very important values that we need, and also shortcomings, some of which I mentioned. And so this ability to recognize that these categories, that the negatives are just inevitably part of the evolutionary scaffolding, if you will, that was necessary for building this cultural structure. But as we move forward, ideally, we'll be able to make agreement where no agreement's been possible before, when we use this practice, seeing our opponents for their positives, not ignoring the negatives, but not just seeing them for their negatives. So let's just go to the next slide. Here's a polarity on the right between traditionalism in yellow and fiscally conservative and libertarian modernity on the left. And again, I'm sorry that I got all these words that are not readable in this slide, but I'm just showing, and these are in the book and online, and I'm happy to send these to anybody who wants to look at them more closely. But it's very important that we appropriately valorize, right? So in other words, in order to see a value, you actually have to value it, right? It's not something you can see a little bit from the outside and you can say, okay, well, libertarians value freedom. I mean, that's obvious. But there's a way in which the fullness of what that value means only becomes apparent to your perception and consciousness when you authentically value it and feel the metabolism of that form of transcendence. So we have these liberty values, and those are all the concerns of fiscal modernity, very much about preserving the original impetus of modernity, which is freeing the individual from the oppression of the collective, right? And of course, there's a whole bunch of negatives that go with that. But that's a category for which this activity of teasing apart the good from the bad is a live and important option if we're going to use cultural intelligence. Same thing on the far right, the traditionalists. I call these heritage values, and these are very important. The upside, I mean, because the downside of heritage values are so evident in there. It's bigotry, it's racism, it's sexism, it's homophobia, it's authoritarian tendencies. Right? There's many scary things which really make it important that we don't create a theocracy, or we don't allow traditionalism to dictate our laws. But nevertheless, there are elements of traditionalism that support this larger cultural ecosystem. And these include values like recognition of the sanctity of the family, even though we might have a more open and liberal interpretation of how a family might be constituted. The idea of the family itself is still a very important value and will continue to be, long into human history. We could also see the value of a sacrifice of self-interest for the greater good of the whole, or fair play, or honesty, right? So these are values that are held by other worldviews. But patriotism, for example, is a value that's rooted in this traditional cultural structure. And there's elements of this that I argue we need to carry forward. And so being able to carry forward the values of every one of these major blocks of American society, it becomes possible once we've distinguished, and it's a process of continuously distinguishing the inevitable shortcomings, pathologies, and threats that each one of these worldviews hold. And of course, it's, that is, if you're in a given worldview, it's the threats of the others that you see, and the threats of your own, or the shortcomings or pathology of your own worldview, which you sort of discount or give a pass to, or not particularly troubled by. But with cultural intelligence, you get to not only be appreciative and the ability to metabolize the positives from every one of these structures, but also clearly distinguish the negatives and the threats and the reason why none of them are the end of history. So let me give you an example. That's enough for this slide for now. You can take slides down. An example of how cultural intelligence might work. It involves crafting political positions and opinions that, in a sense, try to give wins, like a win-win-win-win, a win to every one of these value structures. And this is a technique that we're working on at the Institute for Cultural Evolution, where we have evolving white papers on issues like immigration and healthcare and climate change and education. And we're going to eventually have a large platform with every one of these issues where we analyze how we could give a win to progressivism on this issue, a win to modernity, and even a win to traditionalism on this. and that this is a new technique for reaching political agreement that can transcend the hyperpolarized condition. And so the prime example of this is the rapid success over the last 5 years of the issue of gay marriage or gay equality, right? So before 2015, even people who were highly influenced by the progressive moral system like Barack Obama were ambivalent at best regarding gay marriage, right? Part of it was for political reasons. They didn't want to upset, a big part of the electorate, but part of it was just a sort of lack of moral clarity that gay marriage is a fundamental liberal right, which every person who's gay should have. So there was a lot of opposition to it. But part of the reason that it was able to succeed both legally, politically, socially, why now the major segments of the population who are arrayed against it have now come to accept it, while there's certainly some people who continue to condemn it. Even the majority or a significant portion of evangelicals are now okay with gay marriage. And part of the secret to the success of that, even though it was probably not done strategically and consciously, it happened, and that explains its success, was that it integrated values from across the spectrum. So the issue of gay marriage, of course, integrates progressive values who want to see equality for gay people who've been oppressed. It integrates these fairness values because the government shouldn't be dictating who can't get married, who cannot. It integrates liberty values because it's a basic liberty. And crucially, the issue of gay marriage integrates traditional values, even though it may not integrate traditional interests. Remember the stratigraphy, the geology I showed? At the level of interests, it's almost impossible to integrate opposing interests in many cases. But at the level of values, it becomes possible to integrate those values, even though the interests are bypassed. So making a family commitment, the family itself, is a deeply traditional value. And so traditionalists, when they saw that this wasn't so much about, this is about making a family commitment for people who happen to be gay, this was sort of a Trojan horse where their values were being integrated even though their interests weren't. And it ended up being very persuasive and kind of melted the political power of their opposition. We can see something similar at a sort of a less significant level with the legalization of marijuana, which has also made tremendous strides in the last 5 years, despite every other issue just about being hyper-polarized and stuck, because it integrated values, all four of those values categories, right? It integrates progressive values, who are certainly don't want to see people arrested for marijuana. It integrates fairness values because it's a medicine that people who, that's been proven to work where other medicines don't. So there's a sense of like fairness. We can't deny people who don't, live in Portland, who happen to live in a state where it's illegal. If this is a powerful medicine for them, then fairness dictates that they should be able to have access to it. It integrates liberty values because prohibition itself, based on some religious ideas of morality, is something that, for example, libertarians are very pro drug legalization, just for those liberty value reasons. And so pot integrates that. And it even integrates some traditional values because the traditionalists are very concerned about local control, federalism, what's once known as subsidiarity, whereas local populations get to decide important political issues like prohibition on their own. So even the people in Utah may not be interested in legalizing marijuana. The idea that local populations ought to be able to control whether it's legal or not, there's a way in which those traditional values are integrated into that issue. And if we were able to take this values integration, this win-win-win-win approach or technique to other issues like immigration or healthcare that are badly stuck at the moment, I think we'd find, at least in many cases, that we were able to generate a consensus through the integration of values where the polarized interests can find no common ground. So that's at least some examples of what I mean when I talk about cultural intelligence. Part of the framing of it is using the cachet of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence was popularized in the 90s, and everybody thought like, wow, well, if I'm a leader, I need to be emotionally intelligent, which is a good thing. It made people embrace the idea and work on themselves to become more emotionally intelligent. And so this idea of cultural intelligence is the same thing. It's a rhetorical device to get people to think, well, am I stuck in my worldview? Am I a part of the problem? Am I perpetrating the culture war on my own side? Not that there's some like common ground. This is not centrism that I'm recommending, or simply meeting in the middle. This is something actually diametrically opposed to that, because we're not trying to meet in the middle. We're trying to transcend the whole thing with something higher that can integrate the whole in a way that, with cultural intelligence can do what progressivism generally can't. And that is view these earlier cultural structures for the good and the bad, to be more sympathetic to traditionalism and to right-wing modernity in ways that progressive discourse, for again, forgivable, understandable, probably evolutionarily appropriate reasons, can't do. But it's not the end of history. We need to go farther. We need to create something that's even more inclusive than the important forms of inclusivity that progressivism brings. And so this cultural intelligence is sort of a handle on how a person can go about expanding their own values, elevating their own political opinion, getting this outside and above perspective, making object out of subject, and thereby becoming part of the solution for a more functional culture and a consequently more functional form of democracy. So
Comment.
that was a mouthful.
Maria.
Pick any questions or comments at this point.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say that this is amazing, and so you are currently working with people in government to help with this, or?
Not really, no. We're working with people in the business world. We have some high-powered folks on our board of directors on the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and we're trying to recruit more. But this effort of the Institute for Cultural Evolution to build a political movement based on cultural intelligence is just getting started. It's for 2021 and 2022, it's going to be a grassroots level to try to gain an audience, try to gain a sense of belonging for people who feel kind of politically homeless. So it begins as a movement building exercise to the point where we become large enough demographically that these mainstream folks, will have a reason to listen to what we have to say. So it's a grassroots thing. And while we certainly are interested in influencing the influencers, including political influencers, they have to serve the people. They have to serve people where they are. That's what politicians do, is they represent people. And so they can't represent a form of culture that's yet to appear along the timeline of history. We have to build the culture so that they can begin to represent it. So, that's the short characterization of what we're up to and how we hope to build this into some kind of movement.
Well, I just want to say it sounds wonderful, and I really appreciate it.
So I have more to say, but let me just make sure there's questions or comments at this point.
Nothing else in the chat box. Anybody have a question or a comment?
I had my comment was synergy, and that the sum is greater than the sum of the parts, when you were talking about trying to find the win-win-win-win-win, which is something Gloria says all the time. And then the other comment I had was with the 4 different groups. I felt some parallel with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Sure. It was just something that I had thought about, and then you commented on it. So anyway.
Yeah, certainly Maslow was a developmental psychologist. He was interested in the personal development of people's needs. But what we're seeing is that the individual development of the person and the larger development of human history, there's parallels. Right? We see the same thing in biology. They have a fancy phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And although that can't be applied in a strict sense, even the most materialistic Darwinians admit that there's something to it. That when you see the embryo emerging in the womb, it does go through these stages of biology. First it's an amoeba, and then it's a fish, and then it's a reptile, and then it's an early mammal, and then it becomes human. that's not entirely an illegitimate observation to see that pattern. And we can see the same thing in children as they grow up from adulthood. They go through a kind of a magical tribal phase. They go through a kind of a warrior phase. They go through a conformist stage. And if they continue to develop, through past those earlier stages, they become a more rational kind of scientific stage. Again, this is not deterministically the path of development for every individual form of consciousness, but it is a larger pattern that impacts the individual. And so what Maslow was charting in these levels of needs is, in a sense, a kind of a fractal microcosm that we can begin to see at the larger level of these cultural structures that I'm talking about. Although it doesn't map perfectly onto Maslow's hierarchy, there's lots of interesting parallels. And I talk about that again in chapter 6 of Developmental Politics. Okay, so we've got half an hour left. I'd like to cover briefly. We've talked a little bit about this form of political perspective that's outside and above. There's lots of terms for it. Pardon me. Some people call it integral consciousness. Some people call it meta-modernism. Some people call it postmodernism, which is an ugly term. Not that again, most people who understand this potential for emergence along the timeline of history understand how very important progressivism is. They're not anti-progressive. They're just trying to build on progressivism by going from the antithesis to the synthesis, including all the important achievements of the antithesis and drawing the circle wider to include those who progressivism necessarily has to reject to make their move, right, to create something better. So it's a sort of a sympathetic view. It's not blind to the pathologies or the threats, but it's able, using cultural intelligence, to try to create harmony among the whole. And again, it doesn't try to kludge them all together in one simple, fantasy of we're all going to be kumbaya and agree. It recognizes that these polarities between these major structures, that the polarities are what give these values their life. They shape and charge the values, right? So the polarity is a permanent part of the structure. We don't want to collapse it or deny it, but we want to keep it from a war where there's no integration to a truce, not a complete peace, but a truce wherein there can be challenge and support, where liberty and equality, pride and shame, grievance and gratitude, and many other similar interdependent polarities can maximize their value creating power. We want to make progress in evolution. We have to create value. And the way we do that, at least one way, is we come to understand for the first time how value works, how it is very much like a form of energy, that it exhibits many characteristics and behaviors that can be compared to the behaviors of the electromagnetic spectrum. Another theme that I develop in developmental politics, this idea of the physics of value or value energy, and how it contributes to political will or the lack thereof. But the way I'll address that in these last few minutes is to talk about the political significance of transcendence. And again, as I said at the beginning, transcendence is this umbrella term, which means something that's greater than you, something that you might even be willing to lay down your life for, regardless of your beliefs. So your children, right, for most people are transcendent, that if they had to, they would sacrifice themselves, not just in their time and in their life and in their money, but even they might lay down their lives if they needed to for the life of their children. It's just that their interests are transcendent because there's this natural sense of greater than self-interest that's in a polarity with self-interest. So again, that's complexifying it too much, but transcendence is a necessary element for a healthy society. And each one of these worldviews have their own vision of transcendence, right? So one way I talk about it is the American dream. So traditionalism had a version of the American dream from the beginning, which was to create a democracy that would be a moral example for the world, right? The Pilgrims talked about the city on a hill, and Reagan kind of took that further by talking about a shining city on the hill, as though this idea of that America was this example, this kind of Gettysburg Address example of this great hope of self-governance and liberal values. Can these survive, right? So there's a way in which pride in America is based on America's successful demonstration of democracy, even though our democracy is run into trouble in the last few decades. For many years throughout American history, there was a sense of pride, and that was a kind of a traditional version of the American dream. And then, of course, modernity had its complementary version of the American dream, which was upward mobility, right? Success. The American dream wasn't, I mean, you know, it's been critiqued as merely, you know, accumulating status and material, and it certainly has its dark side. But if you're living in poverty, like deep poverty, the ability to be, you know, develop yourself beyond that and to have a basic middle class existence, we take that for granted. But throughout American history, that's this idea of achieving a degree of middle class wealth and success. That was a very powerful motivator and a very strong binding element in American politics. Of course, progressivism comes along and in some ways rejects both those dreams. It rejects the rat race, it rejects patriotism, again, for good reasons and not entirely. Again, I'm speaking in broad terms, but you know, progressivism is you know, it's tried its hand at a variety of different propositions of transcendence, and it's got a suite of transcendent ideals. Certainly, environmental sustainability and planetary healing is one of the most important ones. Certainly, social justice, right? Gender and racial equality, economic equality. These are all kind of an American dream, you know, for progressives. We could also say, at least in earlier times, this idea of a progressive spirituality, right, which I've been involved with for many decades. This idea that we're going to create it's now a term of derision to talk about the new age, but you know, the possibility of a new age, an age of Aquarius, a spiritual renaissance, has been one of the dreams of progressive culture really from the beginning. And although it's somewhat been eclipsed by social justice, you know, in our time, it remains as one of the traditional, I shouldn't say traditional, I should say, you know, enduring forms of a sense of transcendence. So from the perspective of cultural intelligence, we can begin to see how every one of these, that transcendence isn't just an ideal. It isn't just whatever we think it is. That, again, as I argue at length, and I'll just assert here, that when we understand that the pull of the beautiful, the true, and the good, the sense that we can always sense that a better way is possible, is a kind of magnetism on our consciousness. You can see at every level of consciousness, right? Okay? All life is striving to survive and reproduce, which is a kind of a primitive form of goodness, which all life is magnetized towards, surviving and reproducing, right? So humanity emerges and we refine our understanding of what's beautiful, true, and good. And so we're able to kind of tap into this upward current, I call it, the upward current of the good, or we could say the upward current of the beautiful, the true, and the good. And each one of these worldviews, as I said, creates this horizon of improvement and this set of values that acts as a channel for this upward current. It sort of localizes this larger current of cosmic goodness into something that's small enough to be applied to the problematic life conditions in history that worldview faces. So each worldview becomes its own channel of transcendence, its own octave, if you will. If you think about an ascending scale of octaves, you know, in musical notes, we can see an ascending scale of the octaves of the beautiful, the true, and the good, what each one of these worldviews represent. And so the opportunity that cultural intelligence gives us is the ability to metabolize, if you will, or feel the magnetism of every one of these octaves, right? Instead of playing a bugle where we've got just one octave, we can play a piano. We've got a whole range of octaves, and our music can be much more beautiful and nuanced when we begin to recognize that transcendence is as necessary for human health as, you know, good nutrition and exercise, right? Where there is no vision, the people perish. And so a key to our political evolution and our future progress is to reclaim a kind of a vision of transcendence, or an American dream, if you will. Maybe that's too limited. I mean, the American dream doesn't really apply to progressivism because their dream is to break out of nationalism altogether and create a globalized world of local communities, right? So nationalism and the American dream are sort of primarily located culturally in modernity and traditionalism. But for purposes of this conversation, let's talk about an American dream, or a dream for the developed world, or indeed a dream for the entire world, which is coming to undersee transcendence, or this upward current of the good from a larger perspective, a higher vantage point, where we can see that this evolution itself from the Big Bang until this moment in history has been working by fits and starts and occasional regressions. Again, it's not linear, it's not simply upward, but there is a way in which the value, so for example, one seemingly objective line of value is the equal status of the genders, right? That we can, I would assert that the more equal women are in a given society, the more evolved that society is. The more equal the different races are in a given society, the more evolved that society is. So there are ways, despite, we have to look in terms of how things can be better and not flinch from being able to say what's better and what's worse. And one of the ways we've made things better is to bring in a degree of relativism, right? A degree of cultural relativism, whereby, Margaret Mead can say, well, it's hubris for one culture to say that it's more evolved than another, right? And so, ironically, that was a demonstration of cultural evolution, right? That is that recognition of global solidarity. And we don't want to be Eurocentric or have a kind of an ethnocentric negative opinion about less developed or cultures that haven't developed writing, for example, or haven't developed scientific medicine. We can take those for granted, and we can bring in a degree of inclusive relativism, and that's important. But we need to be able to recognize that that's in a polarity, that there is ways in which a culture that's more world-centric in its view, that those are worthy of moral consideration, include all sentient beings, that is in some ways significantly and objectively more evolved than a more ethnocentric society that sees outsiders as the enemy who must be killed or converted. So, again, that's to make a full-throated argument for the way in which culture evolves by making things better, even while it also makes things worse and has to make us keep going. That's a complicated proposition, which I could only really assert here. But the idea that what could it possibly be if we want to create a larger container, a larger vision of transcendence that can transcend and include progressivism's notions of transcendence and include these earlier forms. And I would say that this vision of transcendence has to incorporate as much truth as we can possibly know. And the place where in some ways we can find a combination of the most powerful truths that humanity has discovered is in the intersection of science and spirituality, right? We have science, philosophy, and religion. There's all kinds of different human ways of knowing and bodies of knowledge, but the new American dream, or the new vision of transcendence that can at least unite a significant portion of the developed world, if certainly not everybody, it has to be based on this kind of intersection of science and spirituality, as I argue. And that intersection of science and spirituality in its currently most advanced expression is evolutionary spirituality, which I outline in the book, which I describe in greater detail. Evolutionary spirituality is not a substitute for other kinds. It's a sort of a supplement, right? It's a supplement to progressive spirituality, a supplement to traditional spirituality. It can accommodate all of these previous forms of spirituality as lines of development that aren't just anchored in a particular worldview, but that can grow beyond that worldview. So it's pluralistic, it's inclusive, but it's also recognizing that evolution itself, what science has revealed about this structure of emergence and this pattern where something more keeps coming from something less, properly interpreted, this is a spiritual teaching in its own right. And at the heart of this spiritual teaching is that we are agents of evolution, each one of us. That the yearning that we feel for a better way, that the way in which the beautiful, the true, and the good magnetizes us, right, to be good people and to seek beauty and to tell the truth, etc. That these upward currents of the good are really can be unpacked and understood and even cultivated and harnessed when we begin to understand how they're a feature of the universe that could be compared to the electromagnetic spectrum of energy. It's an internal psychic energy that can be very powerful for political will. So again, the new American dream, as I outline in the book, is this idea of the project of evolving culture on every front of its development. And so it's not a linear culture. It's not just there's one growing tip. That's certainly part of it. But each one of these worldviews can evolve in their own terms, right? Even though, people think like a common feature of American life is for children, they might grow up in a fundamentalist household. They go to college, right? They learn about science. They can't hold their religion anymore. And then oftentimes nowadays they're becoming woke, and they reject modernity as well. So there's this kind of movement up these structures of history that we see. But we also see people who remain traditionalists despite it all, and people have a right to be who they are. People who make meaning from a traditional worldview deserve our respect because they're not all wrong. They have, I would say that liberal values themselves declare that we can't demand that they think the way we think. So there's a way in which traditionalism can evolve on its own terms while still being traditionalism by coming to grips with its own negative pathologies, right? With that America's never going to fully eradicate racism until traditionalists themselves no longer tolerate, until they can develop their own internal cultural norms where bigotry or homophobia is condemned by traditionalists themselves. And we see the beginnings of that now. Modernity can evolve, right? By still having a center of gravity of modernist values, but taking greater responsibility for environmental degradation. And by dealing more directly, creating social norms and more concern within modernist culture for these pathologies, which modernity is responsible for. Progressivism too, it can evolve while still being progressivism by being able to look at itself and see the cultural threat that it represents that brought us Trump and will continue to stymie progressive efforts. At least, we may get some progress with Biden, but I would say that that progressivism will continue to be bitterly resisted for some good reasons by people on the right until we can get to a point where their values are better integrated. And that's not progressivism's job. Its job is to break the shell of the old establishment and begin the journey to a higher level of civilization. And so we need to give it credit for that. But we can't stop there because we need to bring along everybody. And that involves going beyond progressivism with another worldview. So there's all kinds of different ways. There's at least 3 ways that we're approaching cultural evolution as a political project, as something that's pragmatic and not just an idealistic aspiration that's not very well defined. The 3 ways are each worldview can evolve on its own terms by dealing with its own progressive pathologies directly. We can see movement of consciousness along the timeline of human history, whereby the center of gravity used to be in the traditional worldview in America, right, at the time of the revolution. Now the center of gravity, like the Python effect, it was within modernity, but we're seeing progressivism getting larger and larger in terms of its demographic power and its cultural numbers. So we're, each worldview can get better. We can move up the spiral from pre-traditional to traditional, from traditional to modern, from modern to progressive. And then we can help create a new, more inclusive worldview, this integral worldview, meta-modern, post-progressive, however you want to frame it, whatever term comes to be in currency, I'll use. But part of my mission and the mission for the Institute for Cultural Evolution is to be a champion of cultural evolution, which is why the think tank is called that, and to approach it from these different perspectives or these different ways of gardening for it. Again, you can't engineer it. You can't force people. You need to sort of garden for emergence, create the sort of right conditions, and hopefully by grace, some new form of life will sprout up, right? Some new form of culture. And so for the first time, we now have life conditions that are calling for this kind of evolution. Einstein's famous dicta that some problems can't be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. And so the level of thinking that in a sense rejected the larger society and precipitated the culture war for good and bad, that level of thinking is not capable of supplying a solution to the culture war, which is why you need the next level of thinking for that, which we're trying to grope our way toward. So that's a kind of, developmental politics in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. Or at least, in 2 hours.
I think, the examples you gave with gay marriage and marijuana legalization are really helpful and useful because you could bring out how they can fit into each of those worldviews. And so I think that the more we understand, the more we learn about these different levels of evolution or different worldviews, and the benefits and the pathologies, the more we learn about it, the more we can address the other, the worldviews that we don't identify with in their own terms. You see, in their own terms, so that they can understand where we're coming from because they can identify with those terms.
They'll resist less naturally when they see that some of their important values are being carried forward. But then it's not a fight to the death wherein their values are going to get extinguished.
Yeah. I love it.
So two quickies here. One is I have sent you some texts. I just want to make sure you're getting them.
Okay, yeah, I'm sitting 6 feet away from my laptop, so I can't operate.
You can't tell, okay. And the other one is, what's your biggest challenge right now?
Well, the biggest challenge is fundraising. In other words, raising enough donations to our nonprofit that can fuel the activities and the people that we need to work with us to help build a political movement. And I mean, it's happening. The synchronicities are falling into place, but we still have a long way to go before we have what we might call a war chest, by which we might actually go about making this way of thinking, putting it on the map, so to speak, and creating a movement. So that's really, the brass tacks is, we need to bring in more people who support it and recognize the potential for this, and who are willing to support it, through nonprofit donations.
Yeah, cash flow is important.
Indeed.
Sorry. There's a question from Bob Whitehouse. What would you like to share with Congress?
Well, I'd like to share from the beginning this idea of cultural intelligence. I mean, in some ways, that's the most accessible, the thing that can give the aha moment of this being a depth perception, right? In other words, the culture seems flat, and then when you begin to see this, that things are developing, but that the development is interdependent and there's an ecosystem here, it creates a huge aha moment. And we're trying different angles to popularize this, obviously. And so cultural intelligence is in some ways the most appealing characterization, the most useful immediately to people without having to see or agree with the developmental dimensions of the philosophy, the political philosophy. They can see that the cultural intelligence is something that we need as a nation, that they could be very useful. And so the idea is intriguing on its face. And then when we unpack it and see what that looks like, and how it does have direct applications to politics, that is something I'd love to share with any congressperson I can get to listen. And when we later in 2021, as we build our platform and we just hired an executive director, right? He starts on February 8th. I'm still the president, but we're trying to hire people. We've raised some money. We want to raise more. So we're trying to operationalize this. It's not just philosophy. And so we're certainly going to be reaching out to Congress people, but we need to do it in a strategic way. We need to be a little bit bigger before we can be credible, because ultimately, political people want to see whether you're, idiosyncratic or a crank, or whether this is fringe. They want to see it validated with credibility, and we have some credibility, but we need to build that credibility, and we're in the process of doing that.
There's another question from Don Dolcinos. I looked at the Institute website. I don't see anyone there with experience in electoral politics. Is that in the plan?
Well, like I said, the point is for us to develop a movement. It's a cultural movement. It's a sense of belonging. I mean, we don't want to be a political party, because we don't want to just be like the Green Party and just be a spoiler or just be another faction along the left-right spectrum. But in some ways, building a movement, I mean, political parties are examples of that, but we don't need to become a party with enough political power to send somebody to the White House to have a significant effect upon American politics. So just like the environmental movement, I mean, there are environmental politicians now who are in a sense representing that as their primary platform. But it took a while for environmentalism to gain ground as a movement before elected officials could run on that platform. So we're not, it's a politics of culture, right? We need to establish this culturally among a significant audience, a significant demographic, before it can have an impact directly on electing representatives. But even before we're able to garner the influence and funding and clout to send a congressman who's a congressman with a congresswoman with cultural intelligence who represents that, we need to build a movement first. And so that's why we're focusing on culture and not upon who gets elected, because we need to move the culture first. And indeed, that's where the culture war, it's not happening. I mean, the natural tendency is to see that up until Trump was to see kind of hyperpolarization as, well, it's the parties that are sorting people, and that most Americans are not polarized. We just need these politicians who are acting bad. We just need them to compromise for the greater good, right? And that's sort of that habitual way of thinking about it. Like, it's just a bad marriage. We just need a good marriage counselor, and we can get them, in counseling, and they can find an agreement and reconcile. But that's a mischaracterization of what's happening. It's not just a left and a right. There's three major worldviews. They're in a developmental relationship. You can't glue the pieces back together. We have to grow out of it. And that's not a matter of just compromising in the middle. So the idea that that politicians need to understand cultural intelligence is something they can use right away. But ultimately, this is not a problem. It's a problem that's arising upstream from Washington. It's not so much, the cultural problem is an effect of the political problem. The political polarization is an effect of the cultural estrangement that's occurred as the culture's been stretched out through its own development. And that's a natural tendency of evolution at every level. That's the way it works. First there's differentiation, and that either leads to a collapse back to an earlier level, or that differentiation eventually leads to the emergence of a higher level of integration. And so following this embedded pattern of evolution, we can look at the differentiation of our society, which has brought about this bitter culture war, as an evolutionary move that's a natural predecessor to the next higher emergence, which is this higher level of integration, which
triggers
this
it. That
developmental
actually
political
triggers
perspective represents.
Yeah, that actually triggers it. I mean, if we hadn't become so extreme under Trump, we wouldn't be longing for something more inclusive,
Yes, but if progressivism hadn't gained significant cultural power enough to threaten traditionalists to feel like they needed a cultural bodyguard, we wouldn't have had Trump. So again, Trump's a symptom. Again, there's counter arguments and nuances. I mean, I don't want to make it simplicitly cause and effect, but I want us to understand that it's this cultural threat that if you're a progressive, you can't see. But if you're a traditionalist, you feel the potential tyranny of progressivism in some very unsettling ways. And those unsettling feelings are very politically motivating, even to the point of voting in somebody like Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Steve, I wanted to ask I just wondered about something. So when you presented the traditionalist, the modernist, and the progressivist, I got the impression that you were presenting them as stages in the evolution, stages in some sort of evolution. Am I correct?
Of consciousness and culture, yes.
Okay.
Not
and so
completely. There's limitations to the stage theory. We have to hold it lightly. But yes, there's differences between these cultural structures, and they do evolve. So
I'm trying to borrow something from the Spiritus, the book of spirits that we study, that talks about individuals living a special life that they have chosen because they have something to learn in that life.
Yes.
And, you know, I can imagine wanting to be any of those because I know that I would learn something from any of those. So one of the concerns I had was presenting them individually as stages in evolution. And I prefer to see it as a whole, like they're all part of the same, instead of seeing them all as one level above the other, all like you need to kind of pass through all four of these, you know. It doesn't matter what order you pass through them in your incarnations or things like that, but that the bigger picture is the being able to sympathize with the others, regardless of which one you're in. My concern is if this is presented as traditionalists are less evolved than modernist, traditionalists are going to be defensive about it. And
yes, indeed. I
yes.
understand the constant problem that we deal with, but I'm going to stick by it and say that a world-centric morality is more evolved than an ethnocentric morality.
Mhm.
I mean, in other words, if we want to make the world a better place, we can't flinch from better, right? We can have a degree of relativism and sympathy, but ultimately we have to say we want a world without racism. And if we want a world without racism, we have to evolve beyond the source of racism, which is, you know, the worldview structures that were characteristic of earlier times in history. And that suspicion of the other was justified. You know, this other tribe across the hill, they were going to kill you if you didn't defend yourself. So there was a way in which these earlier life conditions led to these suspicions. These are scaffolding that were necessary for building that worldview and that earlier time in history. Now we get to remove that scaffolding, but there are elements of those, you know, it's hard to deal with the fact that evolution is progressing, that hydrogen atoms, the debris of hydrogen that occurred after the Big Bang, used to be all there was in the universe. Now here we are, you know, in this amazing world we live in, for all its strife and trouble and suffering. There's still much beauty, truth, and goodness that didn't exist when the universe was simply hydrogen atoms. And so there's a way in which we have to face the fact that things are evolving, and that evolution does create not a linear hierarchy where simply we can stack modernity on top of traditionalism. I take great pains in the book to try to dispel that. But
okay, that's the part.
Relativism, where every culture is the same, we can say that no culture is better than another. That's only partially true.
Mhm. I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so that's about it.
Yeah.
I'm
Thank
kind of
you so
exhausted
much,
after that, and I really appreciate all of you listening and being part of it. And Gloria, thank you very much for hosting us.
Well, my pleasure. And
hope
thank
to see you all
you.
again.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very enlightening.
Very enlightening and very important.
Thanks.
So thank you, Steve.